He called her a textbook, not as a slip, not as something that got away from him in a weak moment. He thought it plainly, the way you'd label a chapter you intend to finish and then close. Fans have spent years arguing over which girl Ayanokoji really wants, Kei or Ichinose, whether the ending is a redemption arc dressed up as a slow burn or a slow burn that never actually intended to arrive anywhere. That argument has been running since the two names first showed up in the same sentence, and it has never once resolved, because it's built on the wrong premise. It assumes he's choosing between two people the way a person chooses. Watch what he actually does when someone gets close to him and a completely different shape appears. Not a triangle, not a burn, slow or otherwise. A pattern, one that has nothing to do with who he loves, because loving was never the operation running underneath any of it. He treats people the way he treats every problem the school throws at him, as data, as something to be solved once, filed, and set aside. That sounds harsh, stated outright like that. It's supposed to. Sit with it for the length of one relationship, and it stops sounding like an accusation. It starts sounding like a description of exactly what's already on screen. The show never hides this, which is almost the strangest part of the whole case. It isn't a twist buried in subtext, waiting for a close reading channel to dig it out years later. He says the word himself, on screen, in a tone nobody around him treats as strange enough to interrogate. That's the real trick the story pulls, and it's a better trick than any hidden clue would have been. It tells you exactly what he is, out loud, and counts on the warmth of the surrounding scene to make sure you don't quite hear it. Start with Kei, because Kei is where the pattern is cleanest. No class politics, no rival factions, no external stakes to blur the picture. Just two people, and whatever it is that actually happens between them once the cameras of the story turn away from everyone else. Before there's anything resembling affection, there's a project. That's worth sitting on, because it's easy to skim past once you already know how the relationship turns out. He doesn't stumble into caring about her. He frames the whole thing from the inside as an assignment, a subject to be learned, the way he'd learn any subject he happened to be behind on. Her insecurity becomes the input. Her defensiveness becomes a variable to isolate and test against. He watches how she flinches at certain words and not others, and files it. He notices what softens her, a specific tone, a specific kind of silence, and files that too. He locates the exact shape of the wound from her old school, the one that made her build an entire persona out of being liked so nobody could ever get close enough to see the original injury, and he studies it the way you'd study a fracture line to understand how the whole structure is bearing weight. None of that reads as cold in the moment. That's what makes it work as narrative, and it's exactly what makes it so easy to miss as an audience the first time through. It reads as attentive. It reads, if anything, like the beginning of an actual love story. The boy who finally sees the real her, notices the thing everyone else in her life walked past without looking twice. Except attentiveness in a person who loves you and attentiveness in a person who is studying you produce from the outside the exact same behavior. Warm eye contact, remembering small details nobody else bothered to remember, asking the follow-up question instead of letting the conversation move on. The tell was never in what he does, it's in why, and the why doesn't become visible until much later once the pattern has repeated enough times to be recognizable as a pattern instead of a coincidence. Watch the specific rhythm of it, because the rhythm is where the method shows itself. He doesn't push, he waits for an opening, tests a small hypothesis about what she needs to hear, watches the result, and adjusts before the next attempt. That's not how someone falls for a person. Falling for someone changes you first, almost by accident, and the behavior follows the feeling with a lag, sloppy and unplanned. What happens with Kei runs in the opposite direction, cleanly enough that you could chart it. Behavior first, deliberate and tested, then a pause, watching to see whether something shows up underneath it that would explain the behavior after the fact. Nothing ever does. He isn't discovering feelings for her that then produce his attentiveness toward her. He's producing the attentiveness on schedule and leaving space for a feeling to arrive and justify it retroactively. The space stays empty every time. There's a specific kind of trust that gets built this way, and it's worth naming because it's genuinely rare in fiction. Not trust built on shared vulnerability, where two people are exposed to each other at the same time and take the same risk, but trust built entirely one-directional. Kei exposes herself to him repeatedly at real emotional cost. He exposes nothing back because there's nothing behind the curtain to expose, and the asymmetry never registers to her as strange because his side of the exchange is so convincingly performed that it reads as reciprocity even though it isn't one. That's the mechanism that makes the whole relationship survive as long as it does. Not deception in the sense of active lying. He never claims a feeling he doesn't have, not explicitly. Just a very precise, very sustained silence in the exact place a feeling would normally be, filled instead with behavior competent enough that the silence never gets noticed for what it is. It works in the sense that it produces exactly the result he was after. She opens up. She lets him see the version of herself she has spent years hiding from her own friend group, the version underneath the curated image she built specifically so nobody would ever get close enough to find it. And this is where the pattern gives itself away completely, if you're watching for the mechanism instead of watching for the romance. Once the lesson stops producing new information, his investment in her thins, not all at once. There's no scene you can point to and say, that's the moment he stopped caring, because there isn't one clean break. It's quieter than that. It's the way interest fades from a subject you've already mastered, the way you stop opening a textbook once you've already passed the exam it was written to prepare you for, and the book goes back on the shelf, not thrown away, just no longer necessary to open. There's a detail worth pulling out here before moving on, because it's easy to treat as coincidence when it isn't one. Ayanokoji doesn't just happen to reach for the word textbook when he talks about her. It's the exact word he'd use for anything else in his life he's decided to master. Written exams, physical tests, the unspoken social rule book of a school built entirely around ranking people against each other. He approaches all of it the same way. Identify the structure, find the shortcut, produce the required output with the least wasted effort, then move on to the next problem once this one stops returning new information. Kei isn't an exception carved out from that method for someone he happens to care about. She's an entry inside it. The single most telling thing about the way he describes her isn't that the word is a little cold, it's that it's completely consistent. He talks about a person he's supposed to be falling for using the exact vocabulary he'd use for a subject he's cramming the night before finals. Nobody around him catches the overlap because nobody's listening for it. The audience isn't either on a first pass, not until the pattern repeats somewhere the stakes are too high to read as an accident. That would be forgivable maybe as an isolated character flaw. People get bored. People give inconsistent amounts of energy to the people around them, and a story that showed only that would be showing something recognizably, forgivably human. It doesn't stay contained to one relationship. In Year 2, Volume 12, the same mechanism gets pointed at someone else entirely, and this time what gets taken apart isn't a mask someone built for self-protection. It's the actual structural beam a person's entire identity was resting on. Ichinose Honami is, up to that point, the closest thing the story has to a moral counterweight to everyone else's cutthroat calculation. Where Ayanokoji calculates, she commits out loud in front of people who think she's naive for it. Her entire standing among her class, her entire sense of who she is, rests on one conviction repeated so often it stops sounding like a strategy and starts sounding like a creed. Nobody gets left behind. Not the weak students who cost the class points every test, not the ones everyone else has already quietly written off as dead weight. She holds that position at real, repeated cost to herself, and she holds it in a school built on exactly the opposite premise, that weakness gets pruned, that resources go to whoever's already strong. She's the one structural argument against the entire logic of the setting, walking around in a school uniform. Ayanokoji looks at that conviction and doesn't see a person to respect, or even a person to out-argue. He sees a lever, the exact lever he needs to pull if he wants a version of her that's more useful to the long-term class warfare structure he's been quietly assembling for 2 years. A version that has stopped believing everyone is worth saving, because a class leader who still believes that is a liability inside the kind of endgame he's steering toward. So he pulls it. He goes after the belief directly, methodically, the way you'd go after a load-bearing wall if you wanted the whole building to come down in one clean collapse instead of a slow, messy crumble that leaves debris everywhere. There's no rage in how he does it. That's almost the most unsettling detail, more than the act itself. No satisfaction either, not in any way that registers on screen. No small, cruel smile, no moment where the mask slips and something genuinely ugly peeks through, the way a conventional cold villain gets, at minimum, to enjoy the damage he causes. Ayanokoji dismantles the psychological structure holding Ichinose together with the same flat procedural attention he gave to learning Kei's trigger points. It isn't personal. That's not offered as a defense of it. It's the diagnosis. A person who breaks someone out of hatred is still, in some warped way, relating to them. The hatred requires the other person to matter enough to hate. A person who breaks someone because the broken version is more efficient for a downstream goal has stopped relating to them as a person at all. They've become an input. Notice, too, what he doesn't do in that scene, because the absence is its own piece of evidence. He doesn't gloat. He doesn't linger to watch the effect land like someone settling a score would want to. He delivers the exact information required to collapse her worldview, confirms it landed, and moves on to the next step in whatever he's building, with the same unhurried efficiency he'd use closing a laptop after finishing an assignment. If there were cruelty in it, actual cruelty, the kind that requires the other person's pain to register as satisfying, this scene is where it would show itself, because cruelty likes an audience of even one. This scene has no audience in that sense. It has a task, completed, and a boy already thinking about the next one. With Kei, the textbook metaphor still had something almost tender buried inside it, a boy clumsily trying to understand a girl he was spending time with, even if the method underneath the clumsiness was wrong from the start. With Ichinose, the metaphor stops being a metaphor and becomes a flat description of what's actually happening on screen in real time. She isn't a subject to him anymore, something he's curious about and wants to understand better. She's a system producing the wrong output, and he's the one recalibrating it until it produces the output the plan requires. So, here's where the obvious counter-read kicks in. And it deserves to be taken seriously before it gets knocked down, because it isn't a stupid read. The obvious read is that he's simply cold, full stop. A strategist wearing a person-shaped mask, moving through relationships the way he moves through a written exam, correctly, efficiently, and without anything resembling investment in the outcome beyond whatever it does for his position. Except that read runs straight into a problem the show keeps putting directly in front of the audience, over and over, and it's not a small problem you can wave away. He protects people. Not occasionally, not as a plot convenience trotted out when the story needs him sympathetic for an episode. Repeatedly, and at real cost to his own carefully managed position, in situations where the colder, more efficient move would have been to let the person fail and quietly remove a liability from the board. He saves Horikita from expulsion more than once across the story, spending resources and absorbing risk that a purely self-interested actor wouldn't take on for someone who, for most of the early arcs, barely tolerates him and openly resents needing his help. He quietly engineers Hirata back from the edge after the Ryuin incident breaks him down to almost nothing, and he does it without a speech, without anything that plays for an audience. A series of small interventions that only make sense if the actual goal is getting Hirata functional again, not just neutralizing him as a problem. He picks his moments with a precision that looks, on a surface read, like patience born of care, never pushing while Hirata is still raw, stepping in exactly when a nudge will land instead of bounce off. A person who genuinely didn't care how Hirata felt wouldn't need to time it that carefully. Timing that precise takes attention, and attention this specific is easy to mistake for tenderness, because in almost every other story it would be tenderness. Here, it's closer to a technician who understands his instrument well enough to know exactly which setting to adjust and exactly when the adjustment will hold. He reshapes Kei's entire self-image over time, pulls her back from a place where she was, by her own account, closer to disappearing than to surviving. That process alone takes patience most people wouldn't spend on a stranger, let alone maintain across the repeated setbacks a rebuild like that actually requires. The days it doesn't work, the moments she reverts to the old defensive persona out of habit, the slow, unglamorous grind of getting someone to trust a version of herself she'd spent years being taught to hate. If he genuinely feels nothing, the cartoon villain version of cold, empty all the way down, none of that arithmetic works. You don't spend your own political capital, in a school where capital is everything, rescuing people you're indifferent to. Indifference doesn't reach into someone's collapsing sense of self and rebuild it piece by piece. For a real stretch of the story, it looks like the cold strategist theory is about to break under its own weight, and it should look that way. A counterargument that gets knocked down too quickly isn't a counterargument at all. It has to feel for a while like it might genuinely be the right answer, otherwise the reversal that follows means nothing. Push on it a little further before it resolves, because the show gives it more than one chance to hold up. Look at how careful Ayanokoji is specifically about which people get the rescue treatment and which don't. He doesn't intervene for every struggling student in his orbit. Plenty of classmates slide towards expulsion, towards social collapse, towards irrelevance, and he does nothing, watches without comment, lets the outcome fall where it falls. If the rescues were about compassion in any straightforward sense, that selectivity wouldn't track. Compassion, even rationed compassion, tends to respond to who's suffering most, not to who's most structurally useful later. His selectivity tracks something else entirely. Every single person he intervenes for turns out, on a longer timeline, to matter to the specific outcome he's steering the class towards. That's not proof by itself, but it's the kind of detail that should make you suspicious of the warm read before you're ready to let go of it. Sit with the counterargument a little longer because it still has one more card to play, and it's the strongest one. If this were purely instrumental, purely about maintaining useful pieces on a board, why does he take on personal risk to do it? Saving Horikita costs him exposure. It puts his own capability on display in front of people he'd rather keep underestimating him. Stabilizing Hirata means spending time and social capital on a boy who isn't even in his own class with no guarantee it pays off later. A calculator that cold, that purely self-interested, should be pruning risk wherever possible, not absorbing it on behalf of people who don't yet know to be grateful for it. That's the version of the counterargument worth taking seriously all the way to the edge, because it's the version that almost survives. Almost. It doesn't break, in the end. It just needed the right comparison, and the show has been quietly supplying that comparison the whole time without ever spelling it out in narration. Even the risk question folds into it once you're looking at the right model. A mechanic who's invested real time getting an engine running exactly the way he wants it doesn't treat that engine as disposable just because fixing it cost him something. The cost is exactly why he protects the investment afterwards. Ayanokoji spending exposure and social capital to save Horikita isn't evidence of warmth breaking through the calculation. It's evidence of how much the calculation already priced her in as worth the spend, which is a colder conclusion than it sounds like at first, not a warmer one. People assume risk and warmth travel together, because in most relationships they do. Here, they're just two readings of the same expenditure, and only one of them survives contact with everything else in the pattern. Think about what a mechanic does to an engine that's underperforming. He opens it up, he finds the part that's failing, a belt worn thin, a valve out of alignment, something producing less output than the system as a whole needs from it. He repairs it. Sometimes he recalibrates the entire assembly from scratch, replacing more than the one failing part because the failure was never really isolated to begin with. None of that requires him to feel anything toward the engine itself. It requires the engine to keep running because the engine matters to something beyond its own welfare. The car, the route, the destination waiting at the other end. The engine's condition isn't the point. Its function is the only thing being tracked. Run Ayanokoji's rescues through that filter, and every one of them lines up with unsettling precision. Horikita gets saved because Horikita is a piece he still needs functioning on the board. Sharp, capable, positioned to matter later in ways that only make sense if she stays in the game rather than getting removed early. Hirata gets stabilized because a broken Hirata is a liability to the class structure Ayanokoji has been quietly steering toward a specific outcome for 2 years. A collapsed leader creates a kind of chaos he'd then have to manage some other more expensive way. Kei gets rebuilt patiently and methodically because a stable version of Kei is simply more useful to keep close than a version of her that's falling apart and demanding attention he'd rather not spend on damage control. It looks, from every angle an audience has been trained by other stories to read relationships from, like protection. Underneath that surface, it functions like maintenance, care for the machine, not for the person inside it. That's the piece that resolves Kei and Ichinose at once, instead of leaving them as two separate contradictions the fandom has to keep arguing about in isolation. He isn't withholding love strategically the way an actual manipulator would, keeping it in reserve on purpose, doling it out for maximum effect, fully aware the whole time of exactly what he's choosing not to give. That would require the thing to exist somewhere inside him, held back deliberately, which would at least make him legible as a villain in the traditional sense. What the evidence actually points to is stranger and in some ways colder than that. He doesn't appear to have access to it in the first place, not suppressing it, not hiding it behind a mask he can drop when it's safe, missing it, the way a person who's colorblind isn't refusing to see red, the wiring for it simply isn't returning a signal. He can map, with total accuracy, exactly how romantic attachment is supposed to behave in another person, what softens someone, what earns trust over time, what reads from the outside as warmth. He can produce every one of those signals on command, convincingly enough that an entire fandom spent years debating which girl he secretly loves more, building entire theories on the strength of scenes that were, underneath the surface, closer to a performance review than a romance. What never once shows up in any scene, under any pressure, is the thing those signals are normally evidence of. That's not restraint. Restraint implies something is being held in check on purpose, actively, at some cost. This is closer to someone fluent in a language they've never actually heard spoken aloud, reciting the grammar with perfect accuracy, hitting every beat the sentence structure calls for, while the meaning underneath the words never quite arrives at the other end. Push on that comparison for a second because it explains something the story otherwise leaves strange. A person faking fluency badly gets caught quickly, the grammar slips under pressure, the vocabulary runs out in an unscripted moment, the mask drops the first time the conversation goes somewhere unrehearsed. Ayanokoji never gets caught that way, not once, across years of screen time and dozens of people trying to read him. That level of consistency doesn't usually belong to someone faking a skill. It belongs to someone who has actually mastered the skill completely, the same way he masters an exam format or a fighting style. Study the structure until the output is indistinguishable from the real thing, because indistinguishable output was always the only bar the method was built to clear. He isn't a bad liar getting lucky. He's a perfect student of a subject that was never going to teach him the thing it's usually a proxy for. It's worth naming the mechanism directly here, because the show never states it in clinical terms, but everything visible about Ayanokoji is consistent with it. This isn't manipulation in the usual familiar sense, the kind built on a person who understands exactly what they're withholding and chooses, moment to withhold it anyway. It reads a lot closer to alexithemy, difficulty identifying and naming your own emotional states, sometimes severe enough that you don't register having them at all, layered with something close to instrumental conditioning, where every interaction with another person gets automatically processed as a transaction with a goal attached, because that's the only framework available for making sense of people once the emotional one has gone quiet. Not because he's decided love is beneath him, some cold philosophical stance he's chosen to adopt, because the machinery that would generate it in someone else doesn't appear to be running in him at all, and what's running instead, pattern recognition, outcome modeling, precise cost-benefit calibration, is powerful enough, accurate enough, that it can produce a passable imitation of nearly every behavior love would normally produce in a person who actually felt it. Passable enough to fool the people closest to him, passable enough to fool an audience across multiple seasons of careful, deliberate misdirection. It's worth pausing on why this diagnosis is specific to him and not just the school produces cold people, because the story hands you a built-in comparison and mostly lets viewers walk past it. Horikita starts the series cold too, dismissive, closed off, allergic to anything resembling emotional need in herself or in other people. The difference is that Horikita's coldness is legible as defense. She knows, on some level, that she's shutting people out, and the story tracks her slowly, awkwardly, letting people back in, because there's something underneath the wall worth protecting in the first place. Ayanokoji's coldness never gets that arc, and the reason isn't that the show forgot to give him one, it's that there's no wall to bring down. Horikita is a fortress with someone living inside it. What the evidence increasingly suggests about Ayanokoji is closer to a fortress with the inside rooms never built out at all, nothing being guarded because there was never a resident to guard. Tested against his own reasoning, the version he gives himself when there's no audience left to manage, moments where he's alone with his own thinking, no performance required. He doesn't describe warmth toward Kei or guilt over what happened to Ichinose in the language of a person conflicted about their own feelings, wrestling with something they wish they didn't have to do. He describes outcomes, efficiency, what a given approach produced against what it cost to produce it. If there were something underneath the calculation fighting to surface, some flicker of feeling being actively suppressed, the private moments are exactly where it would leak through. That's where suppressed feeling always leaks through in every story built around a character hiding something real. It doesn't leak through here. The private register and the public register are running the exact same operation, word for word, and that consistency is the strongest evidence in the entire case. A performance slips when no one's watching. This one never does, because it was never a performance being maintained over something else. It's just how the whole system runs, publicly and privately, with no difference between the two. There's a shape to the timing of it, too, that matches the conditioning framework more precisely than a simple diagnosis of coldness ever could. Instrumental conditioning doesn't predict flat, even attention across a relationship. It predicts a curve. Heavy investment early while the behavior is still being learned and refined, tapering sharply once the model is complete and stops updating on new input. That's exactly the shape both relationships trace. The early key arc is dense with attention, precisely because there's still information to extract. The late key arc goes quiet, not from conflict, but from the model having nothing left to learn. Ichinose gets the opposite curve compressed into a single volume, intense, total focus for as long as it takes to identify and pull the lever, then a sharp drop-off the instant the intervention is complete because the objective was met and there's nothing further the system needs from continued engagement. Two relationships that look on the surface like completely different stories, one a slow fade, one a sudden break, turn out to be the same curve running at two different speeds. There's a strange symmetry worth naming before the credits, one the fandom argument itself has been quietly performing the whole time without realizing it. Viewers spend years running the exact same process on Ayanokoji that he runs on everyone else, cataloging his behavior, cross-referencing scenes, building a model precise enough to predict what he'd do next, all in service of answering one question: does he actually feel anything? That's not a criticism of the fandom, it's the only sane way to analyze a character this withholding. But it means the audience's relationship to him has, structurally, mirrored his relationship to Kei the entire time. Patient study, incremental hypothesis, a search for the one piece of evidence that would finally resolve the case. The difference is that the audience's project was never going to cool off once it produced an answer, because the story itself is the subject, not a person on the other end of it. He gets to walk away from what he's finished studying. Nobody watching him gets that luxury, which might be the entire reason this particular mystery kept an audience for as long as it did. Which reframes his isolation completely, and this is the part that actually lands once everything else is in place. The genre has trained viewers for years to read a character like this as a tragic loner, someone the world pushed to the margins, still quietly reaching back toward connection even if he'd never admitted out loud, one good scene away from thawing. That's the comforting version, and it's the version the fandom largely chose, because it's the version that makes the ending feel like it's heading somewhere warm. It's also not what's actually on screen. A tragic loner is isolated by circumstance, by something done to him that he didn't choose and would undo in a heartbeat if he could. Ayanokoji isn't reaching toward anything. He's the one running the calculation that keeps every person in his orbit at exactly the distance he's determined to be optimal, close enough to remain useful, far enough that nothing gets asked of him the calculation didn't already account for and price in ahead of time. Kei doesn't lose him to fate or to some external tragedy the plot inflicts on both of them from outside. She loses him the moment she stops teaching him something new, the moment the subject is, functionally, complete, closed, no longer generating information worth the time it costs to keep studying it. Ichinose isn't broken by an enemy who hates her, which would at least be a story about conflict between two people who register each other as people, opponents who matter to one another even in opposition. She's broken by someone who needed her broken for reasons that had nothing to do with her specifically as a person, and who felt, doing it, about as much as a mechanic feels replacing a part that stopped meeting spec on the line. That's the quiet horror underneath a show that mostly gets discussed in terms of who outmaneuvers whom. It isn't that Ayanokoji is the smartest person in the room, though he usually is. It's that being the smartest person in the room was never the disqualifying trait. Plenty of characters in this genre are brilliant and still capable of love, still reaching for people even when the reaching is clumsy or badly timed. What sets him apart isn't the intelligence, it's what the intelligence had to fill in for, quietly for years, without anyone around him noticing there was a gap being papered over at all. It changes what to watch for going forward, too, if the pattern holds the way it's held so far. Every future person who gets close to him is a new subject entering the same syllabus, studied, understood, eventually either kept on as a functioning piece or set down once the lesson runs dry. That's not a prediction about plot events still to come, it's a description of the only mode he's ever demonstrated applied forward instead of backward. The scary part was never going to be some future act of cruelty. It's the likelihood that nothing changes at all, that the pattern just keeps running, precise and unremarkable on whoever's next. He called her a textbook, and the fandom laughed it off for years as an awkward, almost endearing line, a genius who's brilliant at everything except the one subject that actually requires him to feel something instead of solve it. The classic gap between intellect and heart these stories love to tease and then eventually close. It isn't awkward, it was never awkward, and it was never a gap waiting to close. It's the whole show, compressed into one careless word he wasn't even trying to hide from anyone paying attention. A boy who can read every person around him like an open page, cover to cover, front matter to index, and never once graduates into feeling anything for what he spent all that time so carefully, so completely, so correctly read.